This is Points of Clarity, the CMO interview series from Clear M&C Saatchi. Each interview covers one topic, features two speakers, and in just 3 short questions aims to deliver total clarity. We'll be starting shortly, so do enjoy the show. Hello, and welcome to Points of Clarity, the CMO interview series from Clear M&C Saatchi. My name is Grant Jones, and I'm Clear's Global Marketing Director. We're broadcasting live on Zoom and LinkedIn, and each of these Points of Clarity interviews covers one topic, features 2 speakers, and in just 3 questions aims to deliver total clarity. In each episode, I'll be joined by a senior marketing leader to discuss how they manage the often chaotic world of modern marketing. And we'll do that in about 15 to 20 minutes or thereabouts, but do bear with us if we overrun slightly. All of these interviews are recorded and will be shared live on our YouTube page once we have them built up. This week, I'm interviewing Paul English. Welcome to the show, Paul.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
That's all right, no problem at all. I'm delighted that you've been able to join us today. I'm also pleased that we're going to be talking about a really interesting topic, particularly for professional services firms, but also for anyone who's operating with global and local marketing teams, which is that idea of the global-local model, and particularly talking around how you balance the two particularly well. I'm most interested, I think, on a couple of, or 3 things really, sort of the intent and the outcome, how you balance that in a global and local model. I'm interested in this idea of what you do centrally and what you do on a distributed basis, and again, how you balance that. And then I think almost most importantly, I'm really interested in this idea of coherence and efficiency versus creativity and impact. And I think what I'm looking for is an understanding of how you balance that effectively as a global centre of excellence leader. So let's tell you a bit about Paul before we kick off. So Paul's the global leader for markets and clients at Grant Thornton. Grant Thornton is an accountancy firm with over 56,000 people working in 140 countries. And having been the Grant Thornton UK Marketing and BD Director for 5 years, Paul was asked to take on a global marketing director role in 2012. And in 2016, he joined the global leadership team with a wider responsibility for brand, markets, clients, and indeed CSR. Paul holds distinctions and performance prizes from places like Oxford University and the Chartered Institute of Marketing. But I think more interestingly, he's an inductee into the Sports Hall of Fame in Nova Scotia, Canada. And he once had a short play broadcast on BBC Radio, which was performed by Johnny Vegas. So now I've built you up, Paul, let's get down to business. I think what I want to talk to you first about is new skill sets and ways of working. 2020's changed quite a lot for us. And one of the biggest changes has been marketing activity increasingly shifting online. And for professional services firms in particular, I think that's been quite challenging. So in your mind, what's been the role of a global centre of excellence in driving best practice in digital over the past 12 months and perhaps beyond?
Well, thanks, Gareth. So I would say the first thing is it's a digital transformation in marketing, I think, is a classic early stage market. It's chaotic. It's uncertain. I think there are new terminology, new platforms, new technologies. So I think we took the view that there's a need to create a signal above the noise, to come above all of that, and also to recognise within the complexity of our own network, we've got 140 countries with hugely diverse digital capabilities. So you're trying to look at that sort of chaotic scene and say, how do we get above that, get clarity on what we're trying to achieve? And rather than just sort of putting out rhetoric about let's go digital first, we have to think about how do you enable that? How do you actually build that out and make it happen? So I think we took a view that we needed a focal point and a global transformation program. So we generated something called Next Generation Marketing, which we're now rolling out across the network. And I think we were somewhat fortuitous in timing. We launched it around March, April time. And I said this could either fly or it could crash, right? And it's flown. Like The engagement levels have been fantastic. I think partly how people are working and working from home has created that opportunity. But I felt there was a need to create an identity around this, give it some edges, give it some definition, and create a sense of people in the network that we're trying to do something together. You know, it's a thing, and we're going to work on this together as we go forward. So, do you want me, would it be useful to talk a little bit about what's in that program? Or
yeah, I think so. I mean, one of the interesting parts of me is that sort of sense of togetherness that you just talked about. I mean, it's something that we at Clear and at M&C Saatchi are also talking about quite extensively at the moment. This idea that how do you bring people together in distributed markets and actually get to a place where they feel part of a crew that's working in the same direction as much as anything else? I'd love to know more about how you've done that.
I guess there's three pillars, I would say, and I think the first thing is establishing some common global platforms and some offers. Like how do we lower the barriers to entry to get firms involved and to test and try? So I think that's the first pillar. The second pillar was a global skills benchmarking and development program, again, which I can talk about. And the third thing is really leveraging the power of community and storytelling to build that market and to build that understanding. So those are the sort of three core pillars that we've been working on. Would it be helpful to unpack those? Or?
Yeah, I think so. I think particularly about how you've managed to balance those three pillars and how you've invested in them differently, I guess.
Yeah, I think well, if I take global platforms initially, this was the thought behind this came from just the wrestling match of trying to get a global CMS in place over the last 4 or 5 years. And when I first looked at the digital brand for Grant Thornton, it was a bit of a mess, to be honest. And I think there was different templates, different approaches, different platforms. So if we want to move fast and at scale, common platforms are the way I think we need to do that, which in a decentralized environment is quite difficult because it goes against the grain. Different countries often want to make different decisions. But to move at speed, the CMS was a good example. We're now up to 130 countries, 6 million unique users, common analytics, common governance, common standards. So it creates a gathering point that people can come to as a common language, and we can progress that. So building on that, the next two areas of focus are marketing automation.
Yeah.
So working with Marketo and other platforms are available, but to create a global model. And the other area is social media amplification, which is about trying to get practitioners in the field to use those channels more effectively. So in each of those instances, we try and get a global price deal. We negotiate that down, create a pilot structure that firms can engage with, and just provide some support. That's the only way I think we can move at speed in a distributed way. So it's common language, common standards, and people start to come to that. I see it as a gathering point.
Yeah. I guess if you're making it easier for people, if you're demonstrating that you're helping them and that you're sort of putting the systems in place, but that still allow them some flexibility, that's going to help them ultimately.
Well, it just takes out some of that uncertainty. And I think the way this builds, and back to the storytelling point, is once firms and marketers start to see what others are doing, it validates their own decisions, and it builds, right? It builds off, one leads to the next.
Because I think one of the challenges that you see in sort of global center of excellence models with a distributed activation arm in different markets, one of the challenges you sometimes see is massive divergence away from that core brand message that has been carefully crafted at core and in that central team, because the central team kind of sends it all out, but perhaps sort of almost a bit like fire and forget, says, here it is, you get on with it now, and that leaves the markets a little bit lost. Whereas what it sounds like you're building is something that gives people a sense of comfort and certainty, but support, but also more importantly, a sense that this is how others are doing this. This is how we can all build this together to create that sort of coherent message.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly no command and control in our environment. I think, like many professional services firms. So I always view a professional services network as a market. So you're effectively putting value propositions out there to say, we think this would be a good idea if you engage with this. And once you see other markets doing that, it's like, okay, maybe that is a good thing. I mean, an example recently was we have regular CEO calls, and the Australian CEO was given a general business update. He just dropped into the conversation how Marketo was driving value in their business. He was using MQL, SQL, and within 24 hours, we had eight other CEOs saying, I want to run a pilot on Marketo. And I genuinely think they had no idea what it was, but it's that referral and recommendation that there's business value here. creates a gathering point where other firms say, I don't need to go and think about this. You've obviously thought about this. I'm coming to that place and I'm going to work with you.
It's that power of proof, I guess, and I guess you need to have trailblazers. You need to have people like your Australian CEO who will take that leap to actually deliver those proof points. How do you go? I mean, as an aside, how do you go about finding somebody like your Aussie CEO to be that first person? I mean, I'm sure there are lots of people in the audience who are thinking, I'd love somebody like that to take one of my initiatives and drive it through the rest of the business.
I mean, honestly, it typically comes more through the marketing community, the early adopters in the marketing community. And we tend to work intensively with 2 or 3 firms to help them to be successful. And then we create platforms and stages where they can tell the story. And that's we've got to 127 firms on website. We started with 2, right? And then we went to the 3rd, and then it lifts, right? It's a classic market shape. Once people start to believe and it's validated, the market accelerates. So sometimes people just show up. Like the Australian CEO, we couldn't predict that.
Just say thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much.
No, that's good. And let's talk a little bit more about this sort of control versus creativity thing. So I know it's something that both of us feel quite strongly about. You know, what level of consistency and control is realistic to achieve in the model that you're talking about that really does balance that coherence and efficiency that you're trying to drive across multiple businesses with the flexibility for local markets to stay relevant and be creative in the way that they execute?
Well, I think, if I'm honest, coherence is an interesting word, and we use coherence rather than consistency because I think it better represents the complexity that we're dealing with. Empathy matters here, and I think having worked on both sides of the fence, you understand that non-compliance sometimes is a function of creativity. When I was in the UK, you want to push the brand, stretch the brand, do interesting things with that. So often when people are out in the margins, it comes from a positive intent. They're trying to do something of value in their market. And I think it's important to recognize that rather than be the brand police. But how do we establish the guardrails in a way that retains the discretionary effort? I think there's nothing worse than the disempowerment of people in market just with their hands under the chute waiting to receive something. I don't think that's good marketing, and I don't think that gets the best out of people in an organization. So the way we think about it in a governance way, this may or may not be helpful, is we think about sacred, core, and sovereign. And this is somebody's model, it's not my model, and my colleague Marie Wills may be on this call, but sacred is being clear about these are the things that are in the vault, they're non-negotiable. The things like brand promise, core visual identity, logo, do not touch, right? And that's the sacred piece. Sovereign is close to market, close to revenue. Firms have to have a lot of flexibility there to do the right thing. The difficult bit is in the middle, the core piece, which is like things that firms should do, but they don't have to do. And I think that's where a lot of the coherence comes from, where people gradually move towards things that are good to do rather than being told what to do. So the balance of sacred, core, and sovereign, the firms want it to be a lot in sovereign, not much in sacred. Global wants to be a lot in sacred and not much in sovereign, and it's the usual wrestling match you might expect.
Yeah, because I guess what that allows you to have, and we've just written a piece all around the idea of corporate narrative and how actually quite a lot of the stewards in roles like yours of big marketing programs of big global firms are actually sort of just managing an ever developing story. And actually in the world of in the modern world in particular, it's very difficult to have too much in that sort of sacred box because stuff changes. I mean, who could have predicted what's happened this year? Well, apart from Bill Gates, but there's not many people who were able to say, this year, all of this stuff will happen and we will have to be flexible and agile enough to manage it. And so I find it really interesting when I talk to people like your good self about this idea of, actually the narrative is the bit that matters. The elements that build the narrative perhaps can be flexible, but the overall story that we're trying to tell has to be coherent.
Well, I think, I guess that touches on the crux of it in terms of brand in professional services is delivered through people. It's the brand is created thousands of times every day. And I kind of use a military analogy. I'm clearly not a military person, but there's a nice thought called the commander's intent, which is the commander has an intent of how it wants to mobilize a lot of distributed people towards an outcome. And I think it's the same in brand. If you have a really strong brand idea, how do you translate that into some simple practices and behaviors that can be actioned in market? It's not too overburdened. You're not sending out instruction manuals. It's inspiring actions that people want to take to deliver on the core brand idea. And I think if you try and do more than that, it falls over. So I'd rather have 50,000 people doing one inspiring action towards sort of making the brand strategy visible than having like 200 marketers being spot on in guidelines, right? It's
keeping it simple, which allows people to interpret it in a way that makes sense. I think we see things that have become overwrought. You know, in our game, we see a lot of stuff in terms of purpose statements or positioning areas or territories that become so overwrought, overworked. People start to worry so much about the specific wording and the specific position of words in them, that when they get translated out to markets and to people who are not marketers, to people who are absolutely client facing but haven't really engaged with the marketing side beyond to say, well, actually, what am I supposed to be saying broadly? It can get quite intimidating for those individuals and quite frustrating if they're forced into a particular bucket. So it's interesting you talk about that.
I think you're dealing with professional people who are smart, right? And I think you're trying to communicate the essence of the idea, and then for people to demonstrate that or represent that in a way that makes sense to them. So I won't go into the details of our brand idea, but you can sit in a room and ask people to tell their personal stories, and they'll express the same thought in completely different ways. If somebody's front office or somebody's an audit partner, they understand the intent and they understand the essence of it, and they have to be allowed the flexibility to represent that, because that's back to the creativity point. There has to be some discretionary effort in there. People need to want to do it because they own it and it feels personal. As soon as it feels like an instruction manual, people go cold. You know?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, because you then it's then a question of making sure that you feel like you've given them enough guidance so that you don't end up with massive reputational risk, I guess. We've had a question actually from one of our audience members that talks about reputational risk and how you manage that. I don't know if you've seen that, Paul. But I think this idea of mitigating reputational risk is always one of the things that sits at as a limiting factor on the willingness of central marketing functions like your own to give people the leeway to interpret, because, you know, what happens if they interpret it in the wrong way and it impacts on the global master brand? Do you have any initial kind of thoughts on that, or are you sort of in the boat of actually 95% of it will go well and there isn't as much reputational risk as we think if we give them the right structure?
There is a trust element, and I think in a number of years in this role, there's been very little that is so far in the margins that it creates that level of concern. So I do trust in our people to do the right thing. I think one thing we are thinking about at the moment is there a need for more of a brand and reputation committee of the board? So one thing we've found out in the last 12 months and for recent developments is, in the moment, many firms are thinking, what is our position on this? And therefore, can we think about establishing some global positions around the big agenda items of the day on behalf of member firms, rather than everybody trying to work that out? So I think there is a place for a brand and reputation committee of the board to sort of consider these things and think forward a little bit. Yeah.
That's I think that's a really useful answer, because I think that sort of suggests that, as is happening in our own firm, the need to take much more care of and be much more aware of, in fact, the brand itself and its power for your business is becoming more and more of an issue at Exco level. And I think that brings me on to my last question, really, which is, when you're working with an Exco, I mean, I can't tell you how many CMOs I've talked through our Clear Conversation series this summer, the next series of which starts tomorrow, interesting enough, tomorrow afternoon. I've talked to so many CMOs on that Clear Conversation series about their the kind of the demands on their time that have been produced by the COVID crisis, but not demands on the time in terms of, you know, going out and firefighting, just more because their excos have become that much more interested and engaged with the power of brand, the power of marketing to help them navigate the crisis. So I'm going to ask you, in your shoes as a marketing leader, what can you, in terms of value, what can you bring to businesses and your business to help them navigate the big strategic decisions that are happening much more regularly these days and make the most of new opportunities? Is it really now an opportunity for a reset for marketers and their role in businesses?
Do you know, I'm not sure it is a reset or whether it's just things that we should do anyway. So
Fair enough.
I think, you know, if I think about professional services marketing, when I think about inside out marketing, it tends to be that taking the order mentality. You want to create me a brochure, a thought leadership. It's about sending stuff from the inside out. I think the marketing leaders need to bring the outside world in, own the client voice data, the brand insight data, the competitive intelligence data, and make sense of that and make that actionable. That's always been the case. I think probably the change, I would say, is that we need now more market sensing capabilities that are more forward-looking and more sensitive to the changes that are happening, to stay as close as we can to the emerging needs. So models in our network, peer-to-peer CEO exchanges, bringing 20 or 30 CEOs together, get them talking about the issues. That helps us to get closer to what the issues are, to understand what our proposition might be. So I think there's probably going to be an increasing emphasis on marketing leaders to help with the market sensing, to get close to those issues. And then I think back to transformation, it gets interesting where you start to say, let's overlay that with analytics and say, what questions is the market asking around these issues and topics, and let's inform our content strategy and . So I think that's probably a shift. That's probably something where there will be more emphasis, market sensing and forward-looking insight.
Yeah, it chimes very nicely with what we've been seeing in terms of the requests that we've had from firms that have worked with us throughout 2020, which has been this need for scenario planning, this need because of the multifarious things that are hitting all at the same time, and potentially having impacts in lots of different ways in lots of different markets around the world. We've had a lot of senior marketers turn to us and say, do you know what, how do I work out which of these scenarios is going to be the thing that happens in 6 or 12 months? And how do I parallel process all of these things to make sure that I'm not dropping any balls, but equally know very quickly which ones to cut and reduce investment in? Because I guess that's the magic bullet, right?
Yeah, and I think, to be honest, I think those horizons have got shorter and shorter. And I think, to be honest, my patience for long range planning right now is very limited. If we feel like we're very close to the clients and we understand how they're adapting to these circumstances, for me, that's the critical thing. Until we get that right, I'm less interested in longer term horizon planning. Maybe just me.
Well, what is your long term horizon? I mean, right now, you just said you're not. I mean, are you planning on a quarterly basis? Are you planning on a half yearly basis? How have you shifted? It's about
quarterly, but in the midst of that, we're also in the middle of our 5-year strategy plan. So strategy 2025, which seems, is that the right model? Is a 5-year strategy planning cycle, is that the right thing anymore? If it is, you need almost like 6 monthly review points to make that work.
Yeah.
So yeah.
We've, it's almost like we've prepped this. We've just written a piece on agile strategy, interestingly enough, that talks to that specific challenge. One of my colleagues, Jen Willing, and her team have put together something really fascinating about that, which is that I think a lot of businesses in more traditional and perhaps more slow-moving sales cycle businesses have been quite structured in their overall strategy and also in their marketing strategies. And what this year in particular has done is it's sort of ripped up the rule book in different ways for different sectors. But what it's automatically done is it's forced people to reassess at real pace how they manage quarter on quarter or half on half, some of the initiatives that they're running and how they quickly change those initiatives to match emerging needs. And to do that, to your point, you need to have a real good handle on what those emerging needs are likely to be. And the only way you're going to find that in prof services is by talking to the people who are at client front, client front and center.
And I guess an example of that in our business, and it won't be unique to Grant Thornton, the marketing program went out the window and we focused in on distressed sectors. So, there's certain like hospitality, tourism, aviation, completely reoriented programs and resources to say, we need to talk to these particular spaces right now. And we're going to have to park a number of the other programs to do that. And that happened at speed, driven by the client side teams who said, we need to move. And that helped.
So I'm going to wrap up now because we've already overrun, which I thought would happen anyway. But this has been really, really fascinating. I mean, apart from hoping that Middlesbrough will finally return to the Premier League next season, what are you looking forward to in 2021 as just sort of an overall, this is what I think we can look forward to as a business and as a marketing function?
I'm going to come back to something you said earlier on, that I think the most exciting thing in this role or similar roles is landing that clear brand idea, converting that into meaningful practices and behaviors, and seeing people do those in market and having a positive impact. I think that is achievable, and I think it's achievable in 2021. And if we can just get hundreds or even thousands of people just making one action that they're inspired to do something different to make that brand come to life for clients and prospects. I actually think in these conditions, it's more important than ever, demonstrating empathy, having wider business conversations. So I feel like the conditions are ripe for that to happen more often. And I think that's where I get inspired, where you see large volumes of people doing something different, something slightly different in market.
I think it's a lovely way to finish. I think it's been a fascinating chat. Thank you so much, Paul, for taking the time to talk with me today. Just for the rest of you who are online now, Points of Clarity continues next Wednesday, the 14th of October, at the slightly later time of 3 o'clock UK, 10 a.m. US. And in that episode, I'll be chatting with the lovely and brilliant Renata Pollicicchio, who's Vice President Research and Insights at ESPN. As a leader in the sports world, you can imagine Renata's had quite an interesting 2020, and she and I will be discussing how to empower marketers to manage the chaos of modern marketing. And we're returning to this idea of chaos throughout this first series. You can sign up at the link that we have on our LinkedIn page. Please share that with your friends, colleagues, and connections, and look out for more announcements on some fantastic interviewees that we've got lined up for the coming weeks. Thanks so much for coming along, and see you next week. Thanks very much, Paul.
Cheers, thank you.
Cheers, thank you.